Welcome back, guys. We're going to start chapter 27
I
on
want to talk
Romanticism,
very
Realism,
quickly
and
about
Photography.
the
We're going to be
Aphrodite
looking
of
at the dates from broadly 1800 to 1870. And if you thought the last century was full of a lot of changes and twists and turns, oh boy, just you wait till the 19th century. We are going to see significant and deep changes that are going to build upon what came before. So, quick little summary. We were looking at the late 1700s, and we are starting to see tremendous changes, especially in Europe. We are starting to see new political systems. We saw that with the introduction of democracy in the United States, and the American colonists basically separating from England and forming their own nation. This is going to create basically a sort of series of dominoes falling. We have already seen this in France with the French Revolution, which was extremely violent and bloody and tumultuous, and we're going to see it with a series of revolutions throughout Europe and really around the world. We're going to see nations declare independence from their European sovereigns, from Mexico to Brazil to really, I mean, everywhere, kind of all around the world. We're going to see these tremendous changes. We're going to see new nations form. We're going to see new kinds of governments, not only democracies rooted in ancient Greek and Roman thought, but in the middle of the century, we're going to see the introduction of things like socialism and communism that are really going to shake up the world and create new ways of governing ourselves, some more successful than others, to be honest. But not only are we going to see tremendous political change and the dissolution of monarchies, monarchies that in many cases had ruled for hundreds or even thousands of years, we are going to see technological changes. Because of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the 1700s, we're seeing a sort of an explosion in technology. We're seeing in the late 1700s the the introduction of the steam engine. We are going to see the earliest experimentations with railroads, and this is going to alter the world completely. We're going to see mass industrialization of the world. We're going to see a world that is primarily agrarian, an agrarian-based economy. We're going to see that transform into an economy of industry. We're going to see rural populations move from the country to urban centers. And I mean, just to give you an idea of the kinds of changes we're going to be seeing, this is what art looks like at the beginning of the 1800s. It's very conservative, it's very traditional, it's in many ways, it's adhering to the rules of art that had been established in the Renaissance. This painting of Napoleon by the artist Unger is in many ways rooted in the same innovations that spurred Raphael and Michelangelo and the Masaccio, the artist of the Renaissance. And in 100 years, we're going to go from this, an image that has not really deviated much from the rules laid down 400 years before in the Renaissance. We're going to go from that to this. So how the hell do we get here? How do we go from here to here? I mean, think about this in larger terms. I mean, think about in 1800, if you wanted to travel from one place to the other, you pretty much traveled in the same way that you did for, the past 1,000 years. You either went by foot, or if you could afford it, you went by horse or a horse-drawn carriage. But by the end of the 1800s, you could take a railroad. You can take an automobile by the very end of the 1800s, early 1900s, or by the end of the first decade of the 20th century, you can fly. We go from walking to flying in 100 years. To communicate, instead of sending a letter, which only traveled as the fastest horse could travel, you could send information by Morse code. By the end of the century, you can hear somebody's voice on a telephone. We go from not having photography to having moving pictures in 100 years. We go from a craftsman making things by hand in a very slow and laborious process to mass production techniques, which allows for the creation of thousands of goods every day. The changes are deep and permanent, and they're going to alter the world in a way that the world had never seen before. So the art of this period to me is fascinating because this century moves so fast and the changes are so rapid. And the art is going to reflect those rapid and deep and significant changes. So put on your seatbelts. We're going through the 1800s. All right. I dramatically changed pictures when I should have stayed on this one. Yay. Okay. So, you have at the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, France is in turmoil. And why France? Why France? Well, France is the most powerful nation in Europe, and it has been for a few hundred years at this point. So, we have this French Revolution, which really destabilizes not only France, but kind of leaves Europe in sort of a state of discombobulation. And what eventually happens is those who started this reign of terror, this group, the Jacobins, are eventually overthrown. And in the sort of chaos that is France at the turn of the century, a military leader named Napoleon steps in, and Napoleon declares himself emperor. And with this comes a sort of new phase of the neoclassical. So the early neoclassical was all about democracy, and it was all about sort of the social contract and uniting people together. But now we have a different kind of classicism, the empire. So Rome kind of provides both of these templates, doesn't it? Rome was the template for republican forms of government. They were the sort of template. We think of Daved's Oath of the Horatii. But now we have the second phase of Rome, the empire, and Napoleon is drawing heavily from that. We can skip this map. This is basically just to show you how railroads are beginning to connect Europe and the world in ways that had never been done before. So let's keep talking about Napoleon. Okay. Daaved. We can't talk about Napoleon without talking about Daaved. Daaved is the guy of neoclassical art, whether we're talking in the revolutionary period or in this imperial Napoleonic period. He was arrested in 1794 after Maximilien Robespierre was overthrown, the leader of this violent revolution in the Reign of Terror. Daaved almost died. He was almost executed, but luckily I think his ex-wife actually asked him for forgiveness. And he was pardoned. Now, Napoleon of course, was aware of Daaved. Daaved was the biggest painter in all of France and one of the most influential painters in the world at this time. And Napoleon wanted an artist for his empire, and he chooses Daaved. And Daaved I would say not even almost, but Daaved hypocritically, this guy who's a champion of democracy and republicanism and the champion of the people, basically throws it all in with an emperor, knowing that this is kind of saving his butt, because he could have easily ended up like the other revolutionaries and lost his head, literally lost his head. But Napoleon says, all right, man, I want you to paint my empire. And this is what he does. And this is an image that he paints for Napoleon. This is Napoleon's coronation, his crowning. Now, you'll see that in this image, gone is the sort of starkness that we saw in images like the death of Marat and the Oath of the Horatii, but we get a much more sumptuous sort of image that is more befitting of an emperor. We get darker, warmer tones. We get a much more congested and busy sort of array of people here. And you are seeing Napoleon, who has named Daaved the first painter of the empire, crowning himself. He is in the presence of the Pope, as would have been befitting an emperor. And this is also a referral to the emperor, the medieval emperor Charlemagne, who the French-German ruler, a ruler of a group called the Franks, who really established sort of France as an empire, who went to Rome to be crowned by the Pope, to be declared emperor. And so this is an allusion to that. Although Napoleon is crowning himself because he wanted to show that he was in control. Also, we see the Pope with his hand in blessing, but that actually did not happen. Napoleon's mother is also shown in attendance, although in real life they were having a feud and she was not there. But this is propaganda, guys. This is meant to show what Napoleon wants us to see. This is the art of an empire. And something I forgot to mention, an important detail. Napoleon has actually already been crowned, but what he is crowning his wife, the Empress Josephine. So really this is, it's called the coronation of Napoleon, but it's really the crowning of Josephine. But you can see Daaved has changed his style to fit this new sort of imperial period. For many people, Napoleon becomes this kind of superhero. He's this great leader. He's this incredible warrior and military mind, and a lot of France really unites around him. If you can imagine sort of the chaos of the revolutionary period and the violence and the instability, a strong, self-assured figure like Napoleon, for many, was a kind of a godsend, although he will of course prove to be an untenable ruler because he was basically a megalomaniac who wanted to conquer eventually all of Europe. But there was a sense of heroicism in art, a drama that almost harkens back to the Baroque period. And if you look at this image by Daaved of Napoleon crossing St. Bernard's Pass, this very famous of Napoleon leading his soldiers into battle, this recalls, first of all, Roman equestrian portraits. So there is still that classical thing. This is still neoclassical art, so there's still that reference to ancient Greek and Roman stuff. But look how dramatic it is. The windblown cape of Napoleon, the windblown mane of the horse. This is a time of heroes, and the art becomes larger and over the top and heroic, even though there are still very strong elements of the neoclassical here. The simple color palette, the use of mostly primary colors, and sort of a very strong, focused composition with Napoleon placed smack dab in the center of this painting. This is a work by the architect Pierre Daniele, what was originally supposed to be a church, but due to sort of military setbacks, its construction was delayed for over 10 years, almost 15, really more like 15 years, and when it was finally finished, it had become more like a temple of glory. It has gone from just a simple church, but La Madeleine is really meant to represent sort of, represent Napoleon's power. If you can't identify this as neoclassical, I have failed you as a professor. If this looks like ancient Roman buildings, and especially Greek temples like, oh, I don't know, the Parthenon with its large pediment and its Greek-style columns, although these are Corinthian columns as opposed to the Parthenon, which would have had Doric columns. You know, I have not taught you well if you can't recognize these features. This is very much a building that draws pretty much exclusively from Greek and Roman structures. And I mean, if you didn't know that it was built in the early 19th century, you you would not be faulted if you thought it was a much older building from the classical period. Okay. Antonio Canova is one of the great sculptors, or the great sculptor, really, of the neoclassical period. He's from Venice, but worked a lot in Paris, especially at the request of Napoleon, although he often tried to get back to Italy as much as he could. Napoleon kind of kept him on a short leash. He won a prize to study in Rome, where he learned the art of Michelangelo. He also was known as an engraver and produced a lot of engravings of his work, which helped people become aware of his work and helped him become one of the biggest artists of his day. He was also given a lot of accolades by the Catholic Church. He was named Inspector General of Antiquities and Fine Art of the Papal State. This was a position that was formerly held by Raphael. This is an image of Napoleon's sister, a woman named Pauline Borghese. Borgheses, of course, you've heard this name before. We've seen cardinals, we've seen other important Borgheses in the past. This is one of those powerful Italian families. Pauline, Napoleon's sister, married into the Borghese family, and this is her as an Odalisque. An Odalisque is typically a reclining woman, usually in a quote-unquote Oriental setting, meaning Eastern, usually implying a woman in a harem. This is usually an erotic image. These were very popular at the time. And so we have Pauline Borghese posed as Venus. She was originally supposed to be posed as Diana, a virgin goddess who's the goddess of the hunt. But Pauline was, well, she had a reputation for kind of doing what she wanted and being a little promiscuous. She was very much a modern woman, way ahead of her time in many ways, and there was rumors that she had many different lovers and things like this, and she wanted to be portrayed as Venus. So this was not shown in public, but instead was kept in the Borghese household, and it was actually located, I believe, in the basement, where it could only be viewed by candlelight, because it was so scandalous. This was something that you wouldn't want to show just to everybody. This was, I mean, imagine the sister of the emperor posing like this in this very erotic sort of way. But if you look at Canova's style, you can see we're still dealing very much with the neoclassical. Even though it's an erotic work of art and it's sensual, there is still a sense of sort of kind of a rational arrangement of the figure here. It's not too dramatic, it's not too emotional, but instead it's very rational, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Look at also the smoothness of the skin, and look at the orderliness of the folds in her clothing. This is very much a neoclassical work in that sort of conservatism in which it's sculpted. But it also very much sort of evokes ancient Greek and Roman nudes. She's even lying on a Roman style, or even really more of an Etruscan style, but a classical era sort of chair, lounging in the same way that an ancient Roman would have lounged, or an ancient Greek would have lounged at a symposium. Okay. But this caused a lot of scandal and kind of shook things up a bit. But Canova really embodies this sort of perfection and smoothness that is often associated with the neoclassical. It's very sort of rigid, and even images of love is very sort of controlled. There is a precision and a smoothness to this art, and smoothness was a big thing in the neoclassical. Smoothness was associated with reason and rationality. So we see these very smooth, very unrealistic kinds of surfaces when it comes to representing skin tones. neoclassical is ultimately about the ideal mind, the ideal reason, the ideal rationality, perfection, right? There were several students of Daaved. Daaved had a big workshop. He was the most famous artist of his day, and he had multiple students. Antoine Jean Gros is one of Daaved's major pupils. This is a work he did of Napoleon. Napoleon is on a military campaign. He is at Jaffa, and he is at basically a pest house, a place where people with diseases are sort of kept. And Napoleon, in sort of the tradition here of Louis XIV and other leaders we've seen, it's not only important to show him as a strong military commander, but it's also important to show him as a thoughtful and moral ruler. And so here he is in almost a Christ-like sort of way, going into this disease-infested area. And we see Napoleon even touching one of the patients in this pest house in an almost Christ-like kind of manner. Not implying necessarily that he's healing him, but that he is unafraid, that he is in maybe kind of a state of grace as this sort of great man and this great leader. This is, once again, more propaganda. This probably didn't actually even happen at all, but it's meant to show sort of magnanimity, the goodness of Napoleon. This is Anne-Louis Giroux de Triesson, another student, pupil of Daaved, and Anne-Louis is not a woman. Anne-Louis is a man's name. But I want to show you that there's starting to creep in, and we saw this a little bit with the Odalisque. There's starting to creep in a kind of eroticism and an exoticism into art. As France and other European nations expanded their reach across the globe and colonized the world, it exposed people to it exposed Europeans to foreign places, Africa and various regions of Asia and the Americas. And there was an interest, a desire for this kind of exotic locales of places that were foreign and different and new and exciting. And even though a lot of these images aren't really accurate in terms of the way they depict the people of these areas, these are more like European interpretations of these places. It is important to understand that Europeans were starting to look outside of European traditions and European ideas and European culture for inspiration. And this is going to have a huge effect throughout the 19th century, and it's going to influence what will eventually become known as modern art to an extreme degree, as artists become more interested in non-European things. This is like I said, Giroux de Triesson is a student of Daaved. This is based on a popular story, a novella about a woman named Atala, who is a Christian woman who falls in love with a Native American. This is set in the French colony of Louisiana, the exotic location of Louisiana. And it's basically kind of a Romeo and Juliet thing. They have this forbidden love, and she's supposed to remain a virgin, but she's feelings that she doesn't want to remain, and ultimately she commits suicide so she can retain her purity. And so here we see this young Christian woman, we see a priest, and we see the Native American Jacques, who is holding the body of his dead lover after she has committed suicide. So there is a sense of sort of the exotic here, this sort of wild landscape in the background, this sort of exotic and erotic story of these two lovers who will ultimately never come together, and it's extremely romantic. Keep that word in mind. Another, I think, fascinating work by Giroux de Triesson and which is much more traditionally neoclassical, is this work of Jean-Baptiste Borton, who was a politician and a diplomat in France, and sort of represents a kind of a major sea change in the history of the world with the French abolition of slavery in 1794. This was a man born in Senegal, but taken to the West Indies and served as a slave in the French colonies until he could buy his own independence, and then he becomes an important guy. He becomes an elected to the French National Convention, so Borton basically a representative, and he becomes one of the first men of African descent to hold that position. And this was done intentionally, because once abolition occurs, it was important, especially in France, to show that all men are created equal, because this is very much a part of the sort of Enlightenment ideas. And one of the ideas behind the abolition of slavery is that if we are all free, and if we're all born with certain inalienable rights, slavery absolutely goes against that completely. And so this is not, it is certainly a powerful image of abolition. It is certainly a powerful image of in sort of Afro-Franco history and the history of all people of African descent, but it's also an important image of sort of Enlightenment principles, this idea of individuality and the rights for all of us to have opportunities for happiness. He is standing next to a bust of a guy named Guillaume Thomas Renan, a French philosopher who was very much a big part of the abolitionist movement. Okay. Jean-Auguste Dominique Unger. I know, it looks like Ingress. It's Unger. Don't be angry at me for the way I pronounce it. Okay, so Ong is, of Daved's pupils, his greatest. And I would say Ong is one of the, in terms of his technical proficiency, one of the great painters. Although I find his work to be rather boring, because he is a neoclassical artist to the core, and so there's always this ration and reason to all of his art. And let's be honest, guys, I like a little drama in my art. Okay. So, this is an image of Napoleon on his throne, painted in very much the way one would paint an emperor. Here's Napoleon wearing a laurel wreath, the symbols of the Roman emperor wearing, and Napoleon cut his hair in the style of Caesar for a reason. He's evoking the great emperors of the Roman Empire, and this is an intentional homage to that. But here we see him sitting enthroned with his staff and his symbols of power. In many ways, this is directly tied to like images, say, we saw of Louis XIV, in the chapter or so ago. This is a depiction of the Apotheosis of Homer, a very classical subject. So this is appropriate for neoclassical. Homer, of course, is the Greek blind poet who wrote the two foundational epic poems of Greek culture, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they are personified here, personifications, you know this term, with the Iliad portrayed by this woman with her sword, and the Odyssey with this woman portrayed by her oar. And we have Homer in the center. What is an apotheosis? Apotheosis is this idea that you are taken, if you do such awesome things, you are so amazing that you are taken up by symbols of victory, Nikes are symbols of victory, into heaven, where you become sort of this pantheon of great people. And so Homer, who wrote these two foundational epics of European culture, is having apotheosis. And in many ways, this is sort of Daved's version of Raphael's The School of Athens. He's taken kind of a who's who, but where Raphael brought in a bunch of philosophers. Sorry, windows open. I'm hearing things. Where Raphael sort of brought together like a who's who of philosophers, Unger is bringing together a who's who of creative people, because Homer is this amazing poet. So we have images of everybody from like Poussin here to Michelangelo to Shakespeare. Mozart's in here somewhere, over here I believe. And then also we do have the philosopher Aristotle. We also have the Greek painter Apelles. A bunch of different people. You can look them up. You can Google this. But so once again, very neoclassical subject. We of course have neoclassical classical architecture in the background. And then look at the colors. You know, we know we're in the neoclassical. We're looking at basic primary and secondary colors: red, blue, and yellow, orange, green, and violet. Not a lot of different mixtures of colors here. Everything is very simple and very direct. We have our most important person placed right in the middle, so you know where to look. Everything is orderly and structured and neoclassical. Yeah, I was going to say something, but you know what I mean. Okay. But neoclassical's weird, guys, because we talk about how it's rational and reasonable and it's about this higher moral stuff, but it also can be about things that are erotic and exotic. And here is Unger's very, very famous Odalisque. This is his Grand Odalisque, and in many ways it pays a tribute to Titian's Venus of Urbino as well as other Odalisques. It is erotic, it is sensual, but it's also very, at the same time, very reserved. There's that smoothness to her skin that we are used to in neoclassical art. She is without a blemish, right? And there's almost a kind of a falseness. If you look at her spine is actually much too long. This is not realistic. In fact, Unger added extra vertebrae in her back to create this elongated form, which he thought was ideal for a woman's body. So we're looking at a work of art that is meant to be sort of titillating and sort of erotic here, but at the same time is also meant to evoke those neoclassical concepts of sort of reason and rationality. It's a weird work of art, and that's all I really have to say about it. So, you probably can tell by the way I've been structuring things that things are starting to get a little wilder. Things are starting to get a little sort of off the rails. Because we're starting to see a shift, a change in attitude from the rationality and reason of the neoclassical, and we're going to move into a period called Romanticism. And neoclassical art and romantic art are going to sort of exist side by side. And I talked about the French Academy of Painting in the last chapter. Well, the French Academy of Painting is this huge deal by the time we get to the 1900s, and it sort of dominates everything. And there's only two acceptable styles into the Academy, Romanticism and Neoclassicism. So, in many ways, Romanticism is a reaction against the Enlightenment in neoclassical art. And it dominates the first half of the 19th century. There's an emphasis on individuality. As opposed to reason and rationality, there's heightened emotion, movement, and drama. There's also a lot in here about power and the beauty of nature. In many ways, this is all. Romanticism was a rejection of the Industrial Revolution and the destruction of the natural world. It was sort of anti-urban and sort of pro-rural. There's a writer named Edmund Burke who wrote a philosophical inquiry into the origins of our idea on the sublime and the beautiful. I'm including a video about this book in this module, so I want you to watch that because you'll get a better idea. But what this book is basically about is that Burke says that we have to be sometimes exposed to the irrational because it puts us in our place. Meaning this, he used nature a lot as his example, but things like storms, right? Things like that are bigger than us, that are more powerful us, sort of gives us a better appreciation for the world around us and humbles us and makes us realize that we are just a small part of a much larger universe. I like to think of it if you've ever visited the Grand Canyon or stood at the edge of the ocean and you've thought about the ancientness of those places and the vastness of those places and you felt small to the point where it freaks you out. You have experienced a concept that Burke called the sublime, which I like to think of as awe mixed with terror. Sometimes you've all done this, where it's late at night, you can't get to sleep, and you're laying there in bed, and you start to contemplate sort of the universe. You start to contemplate this little planet that we're on, and we're just one tiny little planet among many in this solar system, and we're so small and insignificant compared to the sun. But then when you think of the sun compared to, it's just one of billions of suns that are part of our galaxy. Just like it, just tiny little specks of light. And those galaxies are just ones of billions of galaxies. And in the grand scheme of things, we're absolutely insignificant and unimportant. And you go, oh my God, I got to stop. Because your brain can't handle the vastness and largeness of the universe. You have experienced the sublime. And for the Romantics, this is important. Romanticism is not just about love. Although it certainly can be, but it's about emotions and passions. It's about nature and the power of nature. But more than anything, it's about feelings and situations that are beyond our control, that humble us, but at the same time expose us to this grand idea of the sublime that is both awesome and terrifying. It's pretty cool stuff. And if you want to listen to some music from this time, I can refer you to Schubert and Liszt and Chopin and Brahms, but most importantly, Beethoven. Listen to Beethoven's Fifth, and that is Romanticism in a nutshell. It is over the top. It is unwieldy. It is powerful. It's extremely loud. It's extremely soft. It's dramatic. It's sad, it's happy, it's sort of everything all rolled into one. And it's huge, it's big and vast and sublime. Literature and Romanticism really begins as a literary movement with Keats and Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron. If you haven't read any of these people, you definitely should. Frankenstein is often considered to be sort of the template of Romantic literature, because it is about a person dealing with forces, the natures of life and death. Dr. Frankenstein, he does what? He goes and he tries to create life by reanimating corpses. He's dealing with the sort of basic primal forces of life and death, and he's humbled by him. His creature does not obey him. It backfires in his face, and he unleashes terror on everybody. That's the sublime. And yet at the same time, there's something rather appealing about that story in a weird way, isn't there? There's something sort of romantic about this man who's doing things that he shouldn't be doing. That's Romanticism, my friends. Pine. Not Chris Pine. Although some of you might think, yeah, he's pretty sublime. I know who you are. I really don't know who you are, but he is a handsome man. But no, Pine. Past, longing for the medieval past, to pre-industrial Europe. There's an interest in things that are old. Gothic art becomes a big deal in Romanticism, but really anything that's old, irrational, the inner mind, insanity, things that are beyond our control. We're going to see one artist, a guy named Jericho, who's going to paint images of people who have mental instability. Nature, there's a longing for a purity of nature, which defies human rationality, and then emotion and the exotic. they loved passion. The Romantics loved passion over reason. We're also going to see a continuation of what we saw with some of the neoclassical artists and an interest in exotic locales, things outside of Europe. So Romanticism, Romanticism and there's some overlap. A lot of times we create categories and we think, well, you're either this or you're either that. But certainly we saw some of these concepts in neoclassical art, and in Romanticism we're also going to see images of classical culture and this concept of the ideal beauty and all these sorts of things that we also saw in neoclassical art. So there's always overlap. Things aren't as separate as people always want you to believe. So this is a Swiss artist, Henri Fuseli, who worked in England and was part of the Royal Academy there. And this is called The Nightmare. And to me, this is a perfect romantic image. It's an image of this woman who's beautiful and dramatically fallen to sleep. And as she sleeps, these forces, literally the nightmare, and this goblin comes and sit on her chest. This is very much about the irrational. There is this belief that when you fall asleep, that rationality and reason that controls our conscious mind is shut off. And in our dreams, our deepest, darkest desires and secrets come out. And here they're represented by goblins and these strange, spectral horses. Pretty cool, right? This is literally reason is taking a nap, and all of that dark stuff in our brains is starting to come out. William Blake is an English artist who was fascinated by classical Greek culture, but also medievalism. And he was really fascinated with sort of a mystic kind of view of Christianity. His views, his images almost look like modern-day fantasy or science fiction kinds of illustrations. He's not only a poet, or he's not only an artist, but also a poet. This is an etching that he colored by hand. So this is a printing, you guys know what etchings are, that he painted by hand. He did this quite often. But here we see the Ancient of Days. This is an image of God, shown in a way that's very common in the Middle Ages, as an architect with his compass here, measuring and creating the rule of the world. But here it almost has this sort of mystical kind of connotation, the wind blowing the hair of God, where he almost looks more like an ancient Greek god than sort of the Christian god that we see, or used to. Francisco Goya is a Spanish artist and very much, I think, a key example of of Romanticism. And this is he was not only a great painter, but also a great printmaker. And this is one of his etchings from a series of prints he did called Los Caprichos, the caprices, which are basically unstable thoughts, right? And here we see this image of the sleep of reason produces monsters. So this is more that idea of dreams, and that when we go to sleep, our logic shuts off. Literally, that neoclassical Enlightenment world is just a thin veneer that's covering up this strange, sublime, scary, passionate sort of self that's underneath all of us. That evokes insanity and instability and darkness. And this is represented in the form of bats and owls. And so if you remember our image of Malebabe, Franz Hals's use of the owl, you can certainly see that playing out here, this idea of insanity and passion. Goya was the court painter of Charles IV, and he more or less modeled himself after his hero, Diego Velázquez. And this is his portrait of the Spanish King Charles IV. Now, this is a very controversial image because a lot of people see this as anti-royalist, as anti-monarchy, and certainly a lot of European nations are moving in this direction. But Goya, his official word is this was not meant to portray the royal family in a negative light, although there are some who believe he's just kind of saving his butt by saying this. Because if you look at this painting, the royal family look kind of unnerving. Notice in the background we see Goya behind the large easel. Does that remind you of anything? Las Meninas, Las Meninas. But in the front we have the royal family. And boy, oh boy, the king looks like he is completely incapable of kinging. His eyes almost appear to be going two different directions. The face of the queen looks like as if she is, as they used to say, feeble-minded. But there is a sense of either insanity or fear or instability in the faces and the weird postures of all of these people. And Goya is saying, I'm just painting what they look like. And certainly years of inbreeding in many of these royal families did lead to mental illness. It did lead to physical problems and emotional problems. And, you know, if Goya's just capturing that here. So here's an image that reflects the incredibly violent times that Goya lived in. The French were very much, or the Spanish were very much unhappy with their king, and they wanted to bring in the king's, a relative of the king in to rule. And basically Napoleon said, okay, I will help you guys out. So he sends French soldiers over to Spain to help the Spanish people overthrow their king and install a new king. But Napoleon never leaves, and he leaves the army there to occupy parts of Spain. And the French soldiers inflicted horrible, horrible atrocities against the Spanish people, and left this sort of created this sort of kind of culture and swath of violence. And the Spanish people tried to rebel. On the 3rd of May, 1808, that rebellion was squashed, and Spanish peasants were executed, basically murdered, for their attempted insurrection. So here is Goya at his, not even his most violent, but certainly depicting a scene of incredible violence. We have the soldiers lined up in front of this man who's holding his arms in the air, Christ-like, in front of this firing squad. Look at the way Goya has composed this picture by making this figure the lightest, the highest in value, almost glowing in the supernatural, divine sort of way. He focuses our eyes here. Look at the way he's painted. It's painted in this sketchy, almost unfinished style where he's emphasizing sort of the drama of the pen marks and of the brush marks over being precise and perfect in his application of paint. Everything about this painting says drama and darkness, literal darkness, because of this blackened nighttime sky and the darkness that human beings are capable of. Goya's work just gets darker and darker. He created another series of prints called The Disasters of War, which I think are some of the most difficult images ever created. They're horrific. They show images of torture. They show images of impalement, of French soldiers cutting off the limbs of human beings. They have images of rape. There's images of basically every kind of horror that could be imagined. And Goya was witness to a lot of these firsthand. He saw the atrocities that the French soldiers perpetrated against the Spanish peasantry, and he was horrified by it. He was also getting very sick. Goya was almost deaf towards the end of his life, and he had developed also a very bitter view of humanity and mankind, which sort of colored his entire outlook, as you can see. And he spends the last years of his life creating a series of 14 works of art in his home near Madrid. And these are known collectively as the black paintings. And this is about as dark as you can get. These were frescoes that he painted on the walls of his house, although they now hang in the Prado Museum in Madrid. So you can see, especially in the image on the right, we're gonna take a look at all of these, but only one or two in depth. But if you look at the image here on your right, this is an image from Greek mythology, Saturn devouring his children. Saturn was told that his children would overthrow him, so he eats them to prevent this from happening. But the god Zeus basically escapes with the help of his mother and slaughters his father, fulfilling the prophecy. But here we see this, first of all, notice this rough, intense style, unfinished and ugly in its application of paint. This is not the smooth rationality of neoclassical, is it? And then we see just violence. We see grotesque violence as Saturn chomps away at his children. We see here an image of severed heads in a landscape. Images of two old men who look almost monstrous in their appearance. An image of a dog. And in many ways, I find this to be the most disturbing, in a weird way, of Goya's black paintings. Called black paintings because they often utilize the color black, or the shade of black as the dominant tone, but also because of their subject matter. But we see this bleak, desolate landscape. This maybe a desert. We're not even sure where land and sky are meet. And then we see this lost dog whose head is all we see peering above what could be a sand dune, lost in this wilderness of confusion and sadness and loneliness. Happy times, guys. We see also images of Judith and Holofernes, which you guys are familiar with. We see other images of almost witch-like women evoking satanic and rituals relating to the dark arts. This is maybe the most brutal of the image. It's called Fight with Cudgels, and it's just two men in an open area with cudgels, basically clubs, clubbing each other to death. And you can see one's head is blood is pouring from his ear and his eye. And for Goya, ultimately, this is all mankind is. It's brutal, and it's violent, and it's unforgiving. This is a man who has lived through tremendous sadness and loss and warfare and seen human beings do unspeakable things to each other. And his view of humanity at the end of his life is one of desperation and sadness and anger. More images give you an idea. Grotesque, often horrific, even sometimes supernatural in its subject matter. This is one relating to witchcraft. This is the witch's Sabbath. So truly, like, he believes that there's almost a demonic quality to human beings. They don't get any prettier. Okay. So, moving on to happier things. There is a continuing debate, and this is something we've really seen since really the Renaissance. This idea of disegno and colorito, of Rubenist and Poussinist, of color versus line, of neoclassical versus romanticism. Now, we also know that those lines are sometimes blurry, but there certainly is kind of a push and a pull in European art, that expression and emotion are more powerful or more important than rationality and form. And then there's sort of the vice versa argument. There's some that say Poussin is the guy you need to copy, and then there's others say it's Rubens with his use of color and drama that you need to copy. So Poussiniste and Rubenist. But this is the same debate that's been going on at this point for years. The Raft of the Medusa is one of the great works of the Romantic era. It was painted by the great French Romantic artist Theodore Géricault. It is a depiction of real-world events. A ship called the Medusa was on its way on a diplomatic mission to Senegal in West Africa when trying to make up time and avoid a storm, the captain basically ran the ship into a sandbar. The captain probably should not have even been the captain because he was unprepared, but he had come from a wealthy and powerful French family and was given a commission as officer of the Medusa. This was actually something not uncommon in the French naval culture of the time, where many men received commissions as officers simply because of what families they were born into, as opposed to the kinds of skills and abilities they had. There were initially 400 some odd people on the ship, the Medusa, and 160 crew. The lifeboats only held 250. So after all is said and done, 146 men and one woman were left on this raft, which was made up of scraps that were left over from the wreck. The Medusa was actually one of 3 ships traveling together. The other 2 boats attempted to tow the raft back and eventually only towed it a couple of miles, and it became too difficult, and they let the raft go. So they literally left their fellow men to die. When the officers returned to France, they had this very different story about the events of what happened, and reported that they tried to save their fellow passengers and crewmates, but could not do it. Eventually, the members of the men on the raft, this led to violence and fighting, and eventually, after a few days on the open ocean with no food, no water, and only some wine, they started resorting to cannibalism and eating the bodies of those who had already died. It was a brutal and horrific event. These men survived 13 days at sea on the open ocean with no fresh food or water. And after all was said and done, only 15 survived. The ship was rescued by a passing vessel called the Argus, and eventually these men were taken back to France. When they arrived, they had a very different story to tell than the one of the ones that the officers had to tell. They told about how the officers abandoned them, how the incompetence of the captain led to the destruction of the ship, and how the other 2 ships eventually cut their raft loose and abandoned them onto the open ocean. This caused a huge scandal for the French Navy and also for the King of France. It was a huge ordeal. The artist Géricault was fascinated by this story. He actually decided he was going to paint this image for the Grand Salon that year, and he rents an apartment, a studio across from the hospital, and he becomes friends with 2 of the crew members, and he interviews them. He sketches the raft itself. He takes in their accounts. He draws pictures based on what they experienced. And the more he sort of hears this horrific, sublime story about the power of nature and about sort of the inhumanity of man against man, his image starts to take shape. And if we look at Géricault's image, you can see the drama. He's basically divided the two sections of the raft into 2 groups of 2 pyramids here, sort of those without hope and those with hope. Notice how he's painted this tempestuous, tumultuous sea, and the bodies are moving and writhing and piled together in many ways in an imitation of the waves. Here he's sort of referring to the sublime nature of the power of the ocean itself. So that whole Edmund Burke thing about nature being kind of inherently sublime and powerful and scary and awesome, all those things at once. We also see, we have a man here waving to the boat, the Argus, a man named Jean-Charles, who was a man of African descent. And it's important that Jericho put him up here because Jericho was also an abolitionist. He was against slavery. And he's using this sort of man here as a symbol for the freedom of people of African descent. And he's literally made him, Jean-Charles, this hero of this work. When this was debuted at the Grand Salon at the French Academy of sort of big show every year, it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. It was originally called just The Shipwreck, but everybody knew what it was about. But the King of France was sponsoring the Grand Salon, and he was there, so they called it something else. Because it would have upset the king, but everybody knew what was going on here. And this was immediately recognized as a great work and a masterpiece, and is still considered sort of one of the masterpieces of the Romantic era. Jericho was fascinated by extremes, like many Romantic artists were. He was excited by images of war and honor and heroism, but he was also fascinated by mental illness. He was asked by a friend of his, a doctor, to paint mentally ill people, and he did a total of 10 paintings of various people at a mental institution in France, trying to capture their sort of tumultuous inner mind. Once again, this romantic interest in extremes, darkness being one of sort of the major themes here, the darkness of the human soul, the darkness of the human mind, is something that Jericho explored explicitly. Jericho died young. His friend, Eugene Delacroix, who actually is posed in as one of the men in Raft of the Medusa, sort of carries on the legacy. This is an image by Delacroix called The Death of Sardanapalus. This is based on a poem by the Romantic poet Lord Byron, but it's about an Assyrian king whose kingdom is being invaded, and instead of being taken alive, he sets everything on fire and has his servants murder all of the members of his court and his harem and his wives, while he just sort of kicks back and watches all this chaos ensue. So in this work, we have kind of everything that Romanticism is about. We have the exotic with this image of this ancient Assyrian culture. We have the images of the wealth and the gold and all of these sort of various people of different ethnicities gathered around him. So this idea of sort of the exotic, things that are non-European in nature, right? Then we see also the erotic, the images of these nude women, and there's almost something sexual in the way that they are being violently murdered here. It's grotesque and it's disturbing. At the same time, it's meant to be sort of partially titillating. This is not easy stuff, and I'm not saying it is, and I'm not saying I agree with what's going on here. I am simply just describing. We have dramatic compositions of these bodies twisting and turning everywhere. We also have this idea of beauty, beautiful things, beautiful people, this idea of extremes. And of course we have violence, which are major themes, all of Romanticism. Delacroix also captured one of the many mini revolutions that occurred through France. After Napoleon, it's hard to keep straight, guys, but the history of France in the 1800s is very confusing because they went through different phases. At one point, they restore. It's actually 2 points. I think they restore the monarchy. They try a socialist commune for like a minute, literally. They try all of these different things because the French Revolution was so violent, left such a sort of uneven legacy over France. It took a while for France to finally sort of right itself. And so there was a revolution in 1830. We can see Delacroix depicting that here with images of soldiers. And in many ways this is realistic. It's an image of warfare, but we also have that romantic sort of drama. We have this personification of liberty, holding the French flag with her breast bared in this traditional way of evoking sort of motherhood and liberty's way of providing for the people of France. So we have things that are real and things that are not real, all sort of confused in this very dramatic, sublime image of warfare and heroism and the strength of the French people. Delacroix traveled, or he was fascinated by the art outside of Europe and cultures outside of Europe. This is an image he did of the war of Greek independence against the Turks. Once again, another image of warfare, of drama, of eroticism and exoticism. But I think this picture tells you a lot of what I think Delacroix was going for. He got to spend some time in Algiers. He traveled with a friend who was a diplomat, and he travels to Algiers in North Africa, and he's blown away. This is his real first exposure to non-European culture, and he falls in love with the culture and the people and the food and the clothing and the customs. And for him, it's everything that his life and that European life is not. It's dramatic and robust and exciting. It's all the things that sort of Romanticism is about. And he painted several images that were influenced. Here, for example, is an image of a tiger hunt. So we see this Algerian man on this beautiful sort of Arabian horse being attacked by this tiger. So once again, we have heroism and violence and nature and darkness, but also beauty, all kind of mixed together. There is a strain that we've been talking about, this interest in non-European cultures, especially Eastern cultures, whether we're talking about Asia or Africa, this idea of what's known as the Orient. And although this is kind of a difficult term to use now, I mean, traditionally Orient just means that of the East. But we have what we call Orientalism as a kind of concept in Romantic art. This interest in things that are Eastern, but not in a realistic way. You know, you can't say that this is really what Algiers was like. You can't really say this is what how Algerian people actually lived. This is a kind of romanticized view of that. An erotic and dramatic and titillating and exciting and romanticized version of reality. But these sorts of images of harems and of exotic women, often displayed in a very sort of sexual kind of way, are not uncommon in Romantic art, and especially that of Delacroix. We can even see this in architecture. This is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And here we see a frieze that is meant to show the departure of volunteers, of people who have decided to fight for the French cause. Once again, in this very dramatic sort of way. So I'm sorry, we're skipping rather quickly here, but we gotta wrap this up. This is a rather long chapter. If we get outside of France and look at other places in Europe, you can see similar themes in art from other places. And this is the German artist Caspar David Friedrich, I should say, whose art is often about nature. A lot of his art also evokes the medieval past. There is a deep interest in the past in general, in Romantic art, but especially in the medieval past, especially tales of great deeds, King Charlemagne and King Arthur, and these kinds of stories of chivalry and great heroic sorts of deeds. And there's an interest in Gothic architecture, and also in ruins and things that are decayed and broken. There's an interest in this kind of aspect of the past too. And so in this image that we see, Abbey in an oak forest, we see an old Gothic cathedral, a Gothic abbey, I should say, and a graveyard surrounding it. So we see, once again, that romantic sort of fascination with death, with nature, with sort of the big subjects, the past, history itself, death, all kind of coming together here. But my favorite Friedrich is Wanderer Above a Sea Mist. And there are several images like this, where Friedrich shows the sublimity, the sublime nature of nature itself. And he usually shows a figure. Sometimes this is interpreted as Friedrich, sometimes it's interpreted as this is meant to be like an avatar of the viewer. But whatever it is, he doesn't show us the face of the person. But instead, he wants this person to be kind of anonymous, as if they are dwarfed and made insignificant by some grand natural scene, whether it's a person looking over a cliffside or looking at the ocean or looking at the mountains. We get this idea of the sublime, of sort of the insignificance of a human being who is humbled by the vast power of nature. John Constable is a romantic, but in a very different way. He's an English artist, and his art was very much a reaction against the industrialization of England. There was a lot of unrest among the farmers and field hands of this period. As life was rapidly changing for them, things became very difficult. Many of them started working in factories and were also treated very poorly. New farming practices are also making traditional ways of life no longer important or valid. So there's a real sense of loss that are being felt by many people in rural areas, that technology is taking over, that the land is going away, and that a way of life is going away. And so there's a real sense of sort of nostalgia in the works of John Constable, who paints nature, but not in this dramatic, sublime way, but almost in a comforting way. His nature scenes are often images of field workers and farmers working the land, showing industry, showing the strength of character given to them by the land. We see a very loose sort of brushstroke in his art, which is very common to Romantic art, but instead of to create a sense of power, it almost creates a sense of comfort and homeliness, doesn't it? I think. But there's a sweetness and a nostalgia and a sort of an old-fashioned quality to the work of Constable that is not evident in a lot of other Romantic artists. On the flip side is another Englishman whose work is as dramatic and powerful as you can get. This is a guy named Joseph Mallord William Turner, JMW Turner, who's one of the great Romantic artists and a very distinctive artist. His work in many ways is almost abstract. I like to think of Turner as a guy who is 40 or 50 years ahead of his time in some ways. He's doing experiments in the 1840s that Impressionists won't touch on for another 30 years, 40 years or so. His art almost achieves an abstract quality. He used color as a representation of his sort of emotional states. and often painted with really bold, brilliant, rich, saturated colors. And in this, we see reds and oranges dominate. And this is a horrific image, as a lot of romantic art is. You're like, man, we need to see some pretty stuff. Where are the puppies and kittens? Yeah, I know, guys. I know, guys. It gets pretty heavy. But this is an image, once again, based on true life, based on a ship, a naval story, a maritime story, very much like The Wrath of the Medusa, but instead of seeing a shipwreck, we're seeing abject cruelty. This was a slave ship, and this is called the slave ship. And this was reported in a book called The History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade by Thomas Clarkson. This is published in 1781, and it's a story of a ship traveling the transatlantic slave route, and there was a feeling that the ship was for insurance purposes. For insurance purposes, the captain of the ship threw slaves over who had gotten sick because he would rather, because of the insurance, it was actually better for them to be lost at sea. He would have recouped his losses that way than for them to have died on the ship. So he takes these 50 human beings and throws them overboard to basically drown. And so if you look closely, you can see hands and chains in the sort of coming up from the surface, under the surface of the water. And look at the way Turner has painted this sunset. It's almost demonic, isn't it? It's almost like the flames of hell itself, because the callous act, the cruel act, the murderous act of this captain, taking these men, not only enslaving them, but then cruelly and casually throwing them overboard, is an act that is worthy of hell itself. And of course, as in many romantic paintings, this idea of the power, the sublime power of nature, the vastness of the ocean, in this case, the sort of provide us with this awesomeness, this sublime sort of quality. The Hudson River School is a school that begins in the United States and is really one of the first American art movements. Thomas Cole was an Englishman who was fascinated by the American countryside and its grandness and vastness. And he traveled the Hudson River. And like Constable before him, he also saw the effects of industrialization. He started to see the countryside slowly being devoured by industry, and he wanted to capture it. And so in this image of the oxbow, Cole has provided us with this beautiful image of the American landscape. We see the storm rolling in. We see this bend, the oxbow itself in the river, with this vast landscape emerging ahead. This is the celebration of the land itself. That, once again, that idea of nature sort of dominating romantic art. Albert Bierstadt, another Hudson Valley artist, Hudson River School artist, I should say, who created these sweeping images of American landscapes. Another one is Frederick Edwin Church, who painted beyond just the Hudson River Valley and would go and painted a lot of the American West in these grand landscapes. If you want to see a church, there's a one called the Icebergs in the Dallas Museum of Art that is just stunning. It's a massive canvas, and this is similar. It's a huge canvas with this image of this twilight in the wilderness. This also alludes to the concept of manifest destiny. That many Americans at this time believed that America was put here by God to be settled by Americans and to be conquered and provided for by Americans, and it was this drive. It provided this sort of drive of conquest westward, and the land was seen as this sort of source of opportunity, of endless opportunity, and its vastness and its natural resources. And so these images are sort of meant to evoke that sense of the vastness of the wilderness that was believed that we had a right to claim, because of this divine right of manifest destiny. Okay, guys, so that wraps up the first half of this chapter. I'll see you next time.